My name is Yair Davidi. I'm speaking to you from Jerusalem, the capital of Israel. I represent Brit Am Hebrew Nations, an organisation and movement that advocates and believes in the origins of Western peoples from ancient Hebraic entities, from tribes of Israel. And this is what we prove, this is what we work upon, this is what we promote, this is what we are. We are dedicated to this matter, and that is the main purpose of our existence in the public domain. And presently we're going to speak about the lost 10 tribes, but we're going to take a talk from this book, and this book, as we said, concentrates upon proving on the whole, in general, the Israelite origins of Western peoples, but also goes into specific tribes. There were 12 tribes of Israel, and each and every one of these tribes had clans, and from these clans altogether you had a great number of different entities. The Bible lists 70 or more of them, and all of these entities eventually also reached Western Europe, and their descendants are to be found and are to be traced into specific Israelite entities, into specific historical groups, and that is what the book concentrates upon. This is our work, the tribes, the Israelite origins of Western people. It is available through our website, www.britam.org, B-R-I-T-A-M-O-R-G, Britam.org, B-R-I-T-A-M.O-R-G. And this work describes the Israelite origins of Western peoples, and it takes each and every Israelite tribe and shows how their descendants are to be found as recognizable historical entities in Western history, from whom derive the nations of Western Europe and of the USA, Australia, New Zealand and related countries, and how within these nations peoples who had historical self-recognition as of tribal origin were in effect members of Israelite tribes, and within these tribes of clans, specific Israelite clans within the tribes, and that very often the very names and symbols of these clans and tribes were retained until the very end. And that is what the book is dedicated to, and for that reason it is worth getting the book. It is worth reading the book and learning from it. But in addition to that, the very beginning of the book, the prologue, as if to say, begins from the back end of the whole story. And that's what we're going to consider now. The back end, by the back end we mean now, our present day and age, the results of Israelites having gone to the West and having lost consciousness of their historical identity, but nevertheless retaining within themselves certain aspects of Israelite characteristics. And that is what the prologue is all about. The book on the whole shows how the ancient Israelites were exiled and they lost their identity. They went westward. Today their descendants will be found amongst Gentile nations. They consider themselves Gentiles. They act as Gentiles. They have the religion of Gentiles and the Gentile consciousness. Nevertheless, they are physical descendants of Israelites, of ancient Hebrews. And they're to be found in North America, Northwest Europe, Western Europe in general, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and so on. The present-day Jews, the Jews of today in the diaspora in Israel, are mainly descended from the tribes of Judah and Benjamin, with a great many also from Levi and from the other tribes, minorities from the other tribes, but that they represent only, they're concentrated on the tribes of Judah and Benjamin, and they're named Jews after, it was the form of Judah. They're named after the previous inhabitants of the kingdom of Judah that represented only a minority of the original tribes. Most of the tribes lost their identity. The Bible describes this, and in the future they will return. They will once again be restored to their Israelite consciousness, and their awareness of the ancestry will once again awaken within them, will be imparted to them. And this is the truth. This is historically proved, and it may be proven from the Bible, from rabbinical sources, from mythological sources, secular sources and general history, linguistics, archaeology, even genetics to some degree. In almost any field that has some type of pertinence to the subject will be found to contain evidence confirming this belief of ours. And we identify different peoples. We show how amongst the French, Reuben became dominant. Amongst the Belgians, people from Benjamin. Amongst the Dutch, Zebulun. Amongst the Danes, Dan and Naphtali. The Norwegians, Gad, the Swedes, Ephraim and Manasseh became important in the British Isles. And so on. And there's proof of this. There's proof for it. And this proof is given, and it is given in all of our works, all of our articles, and in our publications, and in the different talks we have given on the subject. And even without us, even without our contribution, there is proof about it. But we endeavour to enhance the evidence that is available, and we have merited to add to it in certain fields through bringing to light facts that otherwise would not have been known, or would not have been so prominently and easily accessible in the public domain. So this is it. Historically, the first Hebrews was Abraham. Abraham was the first Hebrew, and he was chosen to be the forefather of a nation through whom all the families of the earth would be blessed. See Genesis 12:12. And who would keep the way of the Lord to do justice and judgment. Genesis 18:19. And who themselves will be numerous, great, and be blessed. Genesis 22:16-19. And these blessings were given unconditionally. By myself have I sworn, says the Lord. Genesis 22:16. And these blessings were a means to achieve as well as enjoy. They were a means to achieve the ability to fulfill an ordained national role. The blessings were not so much a reward for what they had done, but a channel through which the national characteristics could bring themselves to expression, and the national aims, or the names, the preordained Israelite aims and role that had been forecast for them could be fulfilled. After Abraham came Isaac. Abraham begat Isaac. Isaac begat Jacob. Jacob was renamed Israel, and see Genesis 32:28. And Israel had 12 sons, and these sons became the 12 tribes of Israel. 12 tribes of Israel under Kings Saul, David, and Solomon. There was the united kingdom of Israel. At the death of King Solomon, King Rehoboam in Hebrew, became the king, and due to his mismanagement, his arrogance, one could say, the northern 10 tribes split apart and founded their own kingdom of Israel. Whereas in the south there remained the kingdom of Judah. It was based on the 2 tribes of Judah and Benjamin. Later, most of the Levite tribes also joined them, and still later in the course of time, the refugees, the minority elements from the other tribes, also linked themselves to Judah. But nevertheless, most of the tribes remained in the north, and these tribes were taken away by the Assyrians, and they lost their identity. And all of the inhabitants of the northern kingdom were exiled, or nearly all of them. As we said, the minority was taken away. In addition to those from the 10 tribes who were taken away, a good portion of the kingdom of Judah, of the Jews, the people from Judah, were also taken away by the Syrians, and they joined the lost 10 tribes. They became intermixed with them. But nevertheless, the Bible emphasizes the Judah aspects of the southern kingdom, and the non-Judah, the more Israelite aspects of the northern kingdom. And they are in their places of exile. The 10 tribes intermixed with the other peoples. They did not. They absorbed still further the foreign influences that had been taken away in the first place, according to the Bible, because they'd gone in the way of the nations around them and worshipped foreign gods and intermixed with them. And this continued in their places of exile. They continued this process of assimilation, of spiritual and cultural assimilation. Nevertheless, physically, more or less, they managed to a significant degree to retain their individuality and their ethnic cohesion. They remained as they were, and they remained in specific areas, linked together with each other in tribal groupings. And they were in the Syrian Empire, different portions of the Syrian Empire. The Syrians settled them there, and they settled them more or less in the same areas. And in their places of exile, they rebelled, or there were changes. The Syrian Empire began to break down. The Israelites reasserted themselves, but eventually were pushed northward, were pushed into southern Russia, the area of southern Russia, and from there they progressed westward. Others of them had previously also moved westward. They linked up with the Cimmerian peoples who had gone westward, who had first attacked, also, the Cimmerians had also been subjected by the Syrians and been enlisted in the Syrian armies. They too rebelled, and they had moved westward before them, and they had taken a good portion of the Israelites with them. And from this grouping came an important elements in the foundation of Celtic civilization. Another group of Israelites had been taken by the Assyrians or by Philistines and Phoenicians, working on behalf as agents, proxies, as if to say, of the Assyrians, had taken the Israelites to the west. They had settled them in Spain. Archaeological evidence proves this, and those in Spain also somehow or other asserted their independence. They were moved to the northwest of Spain, and from there they migrated across the seas to Ireland, or to the north to Gaul, and also to Britain. So there were different movements from different directions, but all of them converged ultimately in the same areas, and reasserted their national independence and their national cohesion. Different groups from the same Israelite origins tended to relocate in the same areas, as if they were an unspoken instinct, or the divine hand of history, the divine providence had directed them to go back to areas, or to go to areas where others of their brothers from the same tribes had already arrived. And this is shown throughout history. This is shown over and over again. This is a general rule that can maybe be relied upon, because it seems to work out all the time. And it's worth keeping in mind that people tend to link up with those of their own ancestry, and sometimes us as individuals may also notice this from time to time. You notice who your friends are, and so on, and who your associates are, and where they come from. And it happens sometimes that you find that their ancestors or their grandparents knew your own, and so on. And this is a known. This is something that happens. The word Hebrew, Abraham, the first Hebrew, was known as Abraham the Hebrew is referred to. Hebrew in Israelite is in Hebrew, in the Hebrew language, is Ivri, or Ibri as it could have been pronounced, and this became Aba, and Hebrew, or Ha-Ibri, from which we get Hebrew, and also we get different names amongst peoples in the West, such as the Iberni in Ireland, and the Ibri, or Iberi, which was the name the Celts called themselves. The so-called Celts, in Western history, we hear of the Celts, the peoples who lived in Britain, and they lived in France, and lived in Western Europe, before the Germanic peoples came in and conquered them and intermixed with them. And so the Celts, as if to say, were as a generic name given to the more Asian inhabitants of the West. But they didn't actually call themselves Celts, they called themselves Iberi, or Iberi, and this means Hebrew. And this has been proven. This is one of the proofs. One of the proofs amongst thousands of different pieces of evidence we have. But it's a point worth noting that they refer to themselves as Hebrew. The Celtic civilization, on the whole, also has a great deal of Hebrew aspects to it. It has the language, the substructure of Welsh and of Irish shows strong parallels to the Hebrew language. It is considered a Hamitic, Semitic substrate. In other words, very similar to Hebrew in its grammatical structure, And also in its vocabulary there are a lot of words similar to Hebrew ones. So it's a point we can speak about it another time. After the Israelites from the northern tribes were exiled, the southern section, the kingdom of Judah, remained, was not taken away by the Assyrians, even though a good portion of its inhabitants were taken by the Assyrians and did join the 10 tribes. The core element remained in Jerusalem, and it resisted the Assyrian attempts to conquer it, and God Almighty saved them. God wiped out the Assyrian army. He killed 185,000 Assyrian soldiers in one night. An angel came down and struck them, and Jerusalem was saved. And from that grew up the kingdom, re-emerged the kingdom of Judah. About 120 years later, or sometime later, the Babylonians came and they conquered the kingdom of Judah, and they took the Jews into exile into Babylon. The Jews went into exile in Babylon, but after that they were allowed under Cyrus the Persian to return to Judah and to rebuild the temple, rebuild Jerusalem, and a portion of them did return under Ezra, Nehemiah and others. They did return and did begin to rebuild the country, and eventually still more came, and eventually Judah redeveloped itself. And from that emerged the present-day Jewish people. There were also Jews who remained in Babylon, and they too continued to maintain their Jewish traditions. And that is the beginning of the Jewish diaspora, as if to say. Later they developed. They had the Maccabees who fought against the Seleucids, against the Hellenites, Greeks, and so on. And then eventually the Romans took over. They had a war against the Romans. The Romans destroyed Judea and scattered the Jews all over the place, especially to different sections of the Roman Empire. After the Roman destruction of Judea, incidentally, the Romans named Judea, or the area, the land of Israel, Palestine. After the Palestine is from Pelicet, which is a Latin pronunciation of Philistine, and they gave it that name because they wanted to wipe out all traces of Israel and all traces of Judah in the land. In the meantime, the Romans became the Byzantines. The Byzantines are in effect Eastern Romans, Christian Romans who spoke Greek, inherited that section of the Roman Empire after the Byzantines, and the Persians took over. The Persian pagans, so they were conquered by the Arab Muslims. And then the Arab Muslims were replaced by Turkish Muslims who ruled over the land, and they destroyed the land. The Arabs and the Turks and even the Byzantines before them began to ecologically disrupt the balance of the land. They cut down all of the trees. They destroyed the vegetation, which increases the temperature of the ground level, reduces precipitation and rain and so on. And it sets in process a cycle of chain results, which causes desertification. Desertification makes a country become like a desert, and that's what happened to the land of Israel, the so-called land which became known as Palestine. And the Arabs took over. After the Arabs also the European Crusaders tried to take it back, conquer the land of Israel, and they were in the area for 100 or so years or more, and in the end they were defeated, and the Arabs came back again, and then the Turks, as we said. Meanwhile, the Jews were scattered all over the area, and they were in Europe. They were also in Arab lands, and they suffered and were persecuted. There were periodic attempts made by the Gentile rulers to force them to become Muslims, or to force them to become Christians, or to persecute them in general, and they suffered a lot. But they developed. Internally they developed. Their religion developed. They also took in converts from the peoples around them, and they had their own culture. And they were entity. There was, if to say, a guest element amongst the peoples. Meanwhile, there were English, French, and Jewish thinkers, also Jewish thinkers from about the 1600s. Actually, the Jewish thinkers the Jews never stopped thinking they never actually even not only thinking, but they made periodic attempts to return to the land of Israel. and to resettle the land. And our understanding is the Jews have the role in this life, in this world, as if to say at this period of time the Jews had the task. Jewish task was to learn the Torah, to practice the Torah, put the Torah into practice, to develop it according to the task, the mandate that had been given them, and also ultimately to return to the land of Israel and to put the Torah into practice in the land of Israel, and to develop the land and to prepare it for all of the other tribes, and for the other Jews who would return to it eventually. And that is the task of the Jews. Whereas in the meanwhile, the lost 10 tribes, according to the Bible, according to our understanding of biblical passages based on rabbinical commentary, the lost 10 tribes have the task to they had to go down, become like the Gentiles, to forget who they were, and then to elevate, to advance, to evolve upwards, as if to say, to drag the rest of the world with them. And that is what they did. That's what they did through colonialism, and also through their cultural and economic influence. Even though this was often deleterious, in some ways it was exploitation, is negative, and today it is very fashionable to emphasize the negative aspects to it. On the whole, it was positive. On the whole, it was a good thing, and on the whole, it did what it was supposed to do. It helped advance humanity. It helped bring humanity to a higher level of recognition of what is right and what is wrong. And that is what happened. So, getting back to the 1600s, in the 1600s, amongst the English and the French also, and other peoples, but mainly the English and the French to some degree. And by English, when I say English, I often mean the British in general, even though the English were the most dominant. The thinkers began to think along the lines of restoring the Jews to the land of Israel, of setting up a Jewish state in the land of Israel. And they began, this is known as Restorationism. Restorationism, it is a political movement, a political and cultural and religious movement in British history. And they began to think seriously along these lines, and they wrote books about it, and they spoke about it. Eventually also the Jews, who'd always thought in that direction, but the Jews began to get themselves more organized, began to put this idea more into modern terminology, to set up organizations along modern lines of political movements and so on. Jews also began this, and this was the beginning of Zionism. First it was religious, then it became more secular. But this was a parallel process. And it increased, its intensity increased in the 1800s. And there was work along this level. And the Jews did begin to return to the land of Israel, which was then ruled by the Turks, and it was ruled by the Turks and Muslim Turks in cooperation with the Arabs who lived there, people of Arab culture. And Jews did begin to return, and they did begin to settle in the area, especially in Jerusalem. And they were faced by the hostility of the Turks and of the Arabs, and also by their very physical conditions. The area was very primitive, and it was not developed, and people who came there had to get along with what existed. So they faced a great deal of hardship and suffering, and it's very difficult, but they persevered. And at one stage they became the majority of the inhabitants of Jerusalem. And this is worth remembering, that even under the Turks, the Jews had become the majority of the inhabitants of Jerusalem. And the British also became interested in the area. Actually, all the European powers became interested in this region for different geopolitical reasons. Europe also had evolved. The Turkish Empire was disintegrating, it was becoming more and more degenerate and corrupt, and so the different European powers were, as if to say, were hanging around trying to pick up pieces from it. And the British and the French and also the Germans all did do this. Egypt was once part of the Turkish Empire. The British managed to take over Egypt and get control of the Suez Canal and other areas. It became important. And then also the British had the British Empire. They had India, which was very, very important at that time, to the British Empire, to the British economy, and linked to India was, and you must remember then it was only travels by ships, so the passage through the Suez Canal was very important to the British. And the British began to think along the lines of also setting up a Jewish state in this area. And not only that, as we said, the conditions were difficult for the Jews, so the Turkish Empire had began to disintegrate, so all different European powers began to interfere. And how did they begin to interfere? By taking under their protection different religious groups. For instance, there were Catholics, a lot of Catholics in Palestine, and also in Lebanon, and still recently, until the Arabs in our time began driving out most of the Christians from Lebanon and from the Middle East, so a great number of Christians in this area, especially in Lebanon, a lot of Catholics. So the French took over the control of, not the control, the protection. They became the protection of the Catholics in this region, and through protecting Catholic interests in this area and people who were Catholics, Catholic men practitioners of the Catholic religion, they began to establish influence in the region. That was it's not all altruistic. It's not only because they were concerned for the Catholics here. They also used it to advance their own interests. Also, there were a lot of Greek Orthodox Christians and Russian pilgrims who had come here, and so the Russians also became the defenders and protectors of the Greek Orthodox and Russian Orthodox people, pilgrims and priests and settlers also who were in the region. And there were also Protestants. Protestants began to establish themselves in Palestine, in the surrounding regions. And the Prussians, Prussia is now part of Germany. It was, but then it was an independent state in its own right, a very powerful entity. Actually, the Kaiser of Germany in the First World War, or his father had actually been the King of Prussia. The King of Prussia became the Kaiser of Germany, of all of Germany. So Prussia was the most powerful German state, and Prussia became the protector of the Protestants. And so we always have the English. The English were there. I had a greater interest in the area than anyone else, and even more reason for being concerned with what was happening, but there's no one around to protect, to look after. So they began to protect the Jews. They took the Jews under their wing, and they helped the Jews. And not only did they help the Jews because this was the Jews were the only ones left to look out to gain an entry through, but also because they had a genuine affinity for the Jewish people. This element does exist in British culture. It was there. They had a genuine affinity for the Jews, and so they became the de facto protectors of the Jews. All this this was parallel with the movement Restorationism, to return the Jews, to give back the Jews, or to enable the Jews to set up an independent kingdom in this region. And this is known as Restorationism, and one of the best books on Restorationism, probably the best book, is Franz Kobler, The Vision Was There. It's published in 1956, at present it seems to be out of print. But on our website, www.britam.org, we have a free PDF files and also HTML files with the whole of this work, which is available to be downloaded for free or just looked upon on our site, and it's worth reading. It's well written and it contains very valuable information, and we would like to see it reprinted, a new publication come out, but until it does, we are probably the only place where it is easily available from. So go there and look at it, and I'll just read a few very brief excerpts from this book, which of Franz Kobler. The Vision Was There. And he said, the idea of Israel's restoration, and by Israel it means the Jews, the idea of Israel's restoration is rooted in the fundamentals of the Commonwealth, that is the British Commonwealth, the British tradition. It is inseparable from the character and history of the British nation, in spite of a temporary abandonment. In other words, later the British tried to renege, to go back on their obligations and their commitments towards the Jews, but never. But the thing was there. It was there. The British had committed themselves to the Jews. They had identified with the Jews, and they began to help the Jews rebuild the land of Israel. And this cannot be denied. And Kobler also says the movement, that is restoration of the Jewish independent kingdom, is an integral part of British religious, social and political history, forming a parallel, not an annex, of the histories of of Jewish Messianism and Zionism. Corbyn, the vision was there. UK 1956, he says that the recognition of Israel's restoration as an organic part of the British political ideas is a genuine religious, humanitarian and political trend within British history. In other words, as we said, it's not a repetition, it's not a development of Jewish Zionism, it's not something that came out of Jewish Zionism. It is something that was parallel to it, that had an independent evolution, an independent development. It was an independent expression of the British national character and of all those associated with British culture. And also there in France we had to a lesser degree, and also in Holland, and there were similar expressions of the will, of the need for an establishment of an independent state within what was then Palestine, an independent state of the Jews, a restoration of the Jewish political entity. Also in the USA, there were writers on that subject. Actually, one of those who wrote a work on this subject was known as George Bush, and he was an ancestor of the President George Bush. So this is worth considering. At all events, Britain was the major, at that stage Britain was the dynamo of this movement. From Britain emerged most of the thinkers and writers on this subject, even though there were also those in other Israelite nations who were thinking along the same lines. And then we had, later we had the First World War, 1914 to 1918, broke out the First World War, and the First World War was fought between Germany, the German Empire. The German Empire had developed from Prussia. Prussia had been the major and the most militant German state. The King of Prussia became the king of all of Germany. The Kaiser of the German Empire was in effect the previous king of Prussia, and he became the ruler of the emperor of the German Empire, the Kaiser. And his son was William, Kaiser William I, and Kaiser William I was the Kaiser, the ruler of the German Empire at the outbreak of the First World War. Together with the German Empire was the Austro-Hungarian Empire and also the Turks. And they fought against the Allies. And the Turks were fighting against the Allies, and they were defeated. The Germans and Austro-Hungarians and the Turks as well were defeated, and towards the end of the war it was decided that the Turkish Empire would have to be broken up into smaller entities, into national countries, national nations. The need for this had been known for hundreds of years beforehand, but whilst Turkey was still functional, whilst Turkey was still a powerful entity, a powerful empire, there was nothing that could be done about it. Now the opportunity had come, and it's decided to break Turkey up into different countries. And so the British issued the Balfour Declaration in 1917, which said that His Majesty's government looks with favour upon the establishment of a Jewish kingdom, of a Jewish independent political entity, within the borders of Palestine, within Palestine. The reconstitution of Palestine as a Jewish state was the original formulation of this declaration, but it was changed. It was changed due more to Jewish pressure, liberal, free-thinking or assimilationist Jews pressured the British government to tone the Balfour Declaration down. But nevertheless it was issued. It was issued, and it declared the purpose of establishing a Jewish state in the areas of modern-day Jordan and Israel. Later, Jordan was cut off. It was given to the King of Jordan. King of Jordan. Jordan was a Bedouin, a bandit, who the British felt obligated to, so they gave him the Kingdom of Jordan, even though he didn't really have much to do with it beforehand. At all events, after the Balfour Declaration and the defeat of the Turks, and the British took over the country, they received a mandate from the United Nations to set up in this area a Jewish polity, and they began to do so. They helped a lot. Also the Jews came in, the Jews themselves with the Zionist organisations, and the raising of funds from overseas, and also the Jews came in and they worked in the kibbutzes, and they set up kibbutzes and moshavim, agricultural settlements, but also cities, and Jews from all over the world invested in this region, invested in the area, and it began to become quite prosperous, and it began to develop, and it grew. Also, Jews came in from elsewhere, and they began to immigrate to the area. They believed in it, and they also saw it as a solution for anti-Semitism elsewhere. They thought that if Jews who were not wanted in other countries could go to Palestine, to go to this new state, they would solve the problem of anti-Semitism. And this is what was happening to some degree. And also because of the development, because of the economic progress that was brought to the area, a lot of Arabs came in, or not only Arabs, Muslims came in even from Bosnia, from Europe, and from North Africa, and even from as far away as Afghanistan, and from South Africa, Pakistan. There it was known as Pakistan. They came from all over. But especially they came from Egypt, which was close by, and from Syria and from Lebanon, and they poured into the country, and they were able to supply the workforce and to benefit from the progress that the British and Jewish investments had brought to the area. And also they increased and multiplied. And as well, together with this, there was agitation, Muslim agitation against the presence of the Jews, against the Jewish designs, and this was fueled by European anti-Semitism. There was in Germany at that time the Nazi movement was coming up, and there were also anti-Jewish organisations throughout Europe, and even in England and in America. There were also very strong anti-Semitic movements and writings and agitation. And all of this contributed to a feeling against the Jews within Palestine. There were riots and attempts to harm the Jews, and the British were afraid of antagonizing the Muslims throughout their empire, and also amongst the British themselves. There were those who hated Jews, or disliked Jews, or preferred Arabs to Jews, or preferred simply to confront Jews rather than confront Arabs. That to choose enemies, they preferred to go against the Jews rather than to go against the Arabs. Even though all the time throughout this period, the overall tendency was pro-Jewish. This should not be forgotten. There's a tendency to forget this or to downplay it. But the fact is that overwhelmingly the Jewish and the British were on the same page and working in the same direction. And it was the British who supplied the infrastructure and much of the economic base for the coming state of Israel. And this continued almost to the very last moment of a British presence in the area. But as we said, there were also those amongst the British who were against the Jews. They helped the Arabs, they supplied them with arms, they trained them. And there were also British soldiers and others. For instance, there were Poles in the British army who became Arabs, who helped the Arabs. And the Kingdom of Jordan was also against the Zionist enterprise, also against the Jews. And the Kingdom of Jordan had an army which was whose chief of staff was British, and had British officers serving in it. So there were British people in Britain who were against the Jews and considered the establishment of a Jewish kingdom in that region to be against British interests. And there were Arab riots and Arab agitation, Arab terrorists, and because of this the British restricted immigration, or attempted to restrict immigration to Palestine, within Palestine. This caused a lot of friction, a lot of trouble, and the Jews kept coming in, trying to come in, and also they began to take measures against the British, even though until the very end most of the Jews wanted the British to stay, and they relied on the British protection and British support for what they were doing. as we said, in Europe there was a growth in anti-Semitism throughout Europe, throughout all of Europe. It was a general European trend. Also was a strong trend within the USA, in North America in general, also in Canada, and in Australia, and South Africa. And in Germany, this trend, this anti-Jewish trend of thought took extreme expression. Hitler came to power in 1933. Many Jews, when Hitler came to power in Germany, made attempts to escape from Europe, and most of these attempts were actually successful. They either, like a lot of Jews, got out of Germany. Some of them, those who were lucky, got to America. They got to other places outside of Europe, but a good portion of them went to neighbouring areas. They went to France, they went to Holland, and so on, and Belgium, and they didn't realise that the Germans would conquer these areas, and they would be more vulnerable than other Jews, and they would be the first to be taken away once those areas were conquered by Germany. This is what happened. So maybe more than 80% of Jews in Germany got out, even though it was very difficult. Also, when the Germans took over Austria, and there was a lot of Austrian anti-Semitism acts against the Jews, and the Jews wanted to get out, and they were clamouring. They were going around begging at the consulates to be allowed to go anywhere, to any country that would take them, and a lot of the consulates shut their doors and wouldn't let them in. And also the Jews in Germany had trouble getting to other areas. But on the whole, those who persisted, and most of them did persist, they got out of Germany, they got out of Austria. Some of them didn't, and even a portion of those who got out were caught later when the war broke out. So this is what should be remembered. And with the outbreak of the war, the Germans conquered regions that contained Jewish citizens and refugees, and then they murdered them. They killed Jews. They killed Jews wherever they could find them. Altogether, 6 million Jews were killed just for being Jews, and they were also tormented and cruelly treated, persecuted, and mocked and degraded, whilst they were being killed, or in the process of killing them, of persecuting them. They were dehumanized, both in the eyes of their neighbours and in the eyes of themselves. This was a deliberate policy of the Nazis, of the Germans, towards the Jews at that time. France had accepted, before the war, accepted possibly more Jewish refugees from Germany than any other country. Britain also accepted quite a few. USA accepted some, not as much as they could have done and should have done, but nevertheless, some were accepted. And when the war broke out, France was defeated very quickly. The French army helped the remnants of the British army escape from France, Dunkirk. They did that. They were quite gallant in this. Churchill offered the French the opportunity to unite France and Britain together to make them one country. The French did not want it. And France was beaten, and a good portion of the French cooperated with the Germans. They set up the Vichy government in the southeast in the southern portion of France. And they were also anti-Semitic. They also contained with themselves right-wing nationalists, anti-Jewish elements who cooperated in the persecution and destruction of European Jewry. And many of these people in France who helped the Germans were people who were enemies of the Jews. Like the enemies of the Jews were also the enemies of France. And this is a general rule, that the enemies of the Jews are also usually the enemies of their own country. Those who are pro-Jewish are usually the most patriotic, the true patriots of their own nations. And this brings us to the subject of attitudes toward Jews in general. As we said, Britain accepted a great many refugees, and also before the war and after the war, Britain accepted possibly more Jewish refugees than any other country. This has to be noted. not only did Britain accept Jewish refugees from Europe, from France and from Europe, but Britain facilitated the passage over to other portions of the British Commonwealth of Jewish refugees, and also facilitated the movement of Jewish refugees to the USA. And many of those who were saved were so saved because of British concern for their welfare, even though it was not as much as it should have been, and even though within Britain itself there were also anti-Jewish elements, anti-Jewish peoples, and this existed throughout the world. It's been claimed that the Allies, in their war against the Germans and their fellow travellers, such as the Ukrainians, the Croatians, the Italians for a time, and people who were pro-German and anti-Jewish throughout all of the conquered territories, and who helped the Germans kill the Jews, such as they did in Lithuania and other places. So it has been claimed that the Allies themselves, who were fighting against the Germans, did not do enough to help the Jews. So this is not so. It is not correct. But in fact, the contrary is what is the reality, is what really is the case. But nevertheless, there were certain anti-Jewish attitudes amongst officials in charge, and these did have a negative effect upon the Jewish attempts to survive. And it is a complicated issue, a very complicated and involved issue. But, and this is not the place for it, but we'll go into a few points here. Claims against the Allies not having helped the Jews include, among different points. Amongst the points are that they didn't accept Jewish refugees before the war, and it's true that they did not to a sufficient degree. Also that they did not bomb Auschwitz and other concentration camps where Jews were being murdered. Also that they did not warn the Germans that atrocities would be punished. And also, and another thing, they did not barter Jewish lives for goods when the Germans offered to do so towards the end of World War II. They offered, the Germans offered to release Jews in exchange for trucks and in exchange for certain goods that they needed. And the Allies were not prepared to countenance such a proposal. And there were other claims, but these are another claim is that they closed the doors to Palestine. They did not allow Jews to come into what was then Palestine. So, and there are other claims as well. Other points have been made, and everything has something in it, but it's not sufficient to make a case. And overall, the Allies were against the Germans. Obviously, they were fighting them, but they were against the German persecution of the Jewish people, and they did what they could to help the Jewish people. But we're just to for the sake of the record, we'll reply to a few of these claims concerning the idea that they did not accept Jewish refugees before the Second World War. It's true, they did not. And part of the reason for not accepting Jewish refugees before World War II was due to they didn't like Jews, or didn't want Jews coming into the country, but there were other reasons as well. And we may also should realise that at that stage they did not realise that the Germans were about to conquer Europe and kill all the Jews that they could find. Perhaps they should have been conscious of this, but they were not conscious. They were not aware of it, or most of them were not aware of it, and also the Jews themselves were not aware of it. And before the war, as we said, my Jewish refugees from Germany managed to find refuge in neighbouring countries. Some went to France, some went to Belgium and other countries. And they didn't realise that the Germans would also shortly afterwards take over these countries and kill them there. And this may be someone who in hindsight, we can say they should have realised this is what would happen, or was liable to happen, but it was not the reality at the time. It was not what people thought at the time. Bombing Auschwitz and the camps and the killing camps of the Germans It may have been technically feasible, and it may not have been. It would have been difficult, but even if it could have been done, it would not have stopped the Germans from killing Jews at whatever cost to themselves. Anyone who has studied the German attitude towards the Jews at the time, the German policies towards the Jews, realises this. Nothing would have stopped them, and it would not necessarily have helped them. So this is a point that should be borne in mind whenever we bring up this question. Also, warnings not to harm the Jews made to Germans. This underestimates the determination of the Germans to kill Jews. It then underestimates the depth of anti-Jewish feeling in occupied countries in Western Europe. And the fact is that such warnings were in effect made, so it's a moot question. And some things were done. Wallenstein from Sweden and lots of Switzerland and Hungary, they saved many Jews. They saved tens of thousands of Jews, much more, and they were in effect agents of their government, and they were being also agents of the government in cooperation with the U.S. authorities. And this, they did what could be done. They didn't do enough, and there were exceptions, but they did do a lot, and this is something that had been done. Also, Roosevelt threatened to bomb Budapest if the Hungarian authorities did not desist or did not alleviate the sufferings of the Jews, and this worked. This threat worked. And a lot of cases, a lot of things were done. And Tom Segev is a Jewish writer, and he emphasizes the pro-Jewish aspects of British policy and British administration in effect. He says that the British kept their promises to the Zionists. They opened up the country to mass immigration. By 1948, the Jewish population had increased by more than tenfold. The Jews were permitted to purchase land, develop agriculture, and establish industries and banks. The British allowed them to set up hundreds of new settlements, including several towns. They created a school system and an army. They had a political leadership and elected institutions. With the help of all these, in the end, they defeated the Arabs, all under British sponsorship, all in the wake of that promise of 1917. Contrary to the widely held belief of Britain's pro-Arabism, British actions considerably favoured the Zionist enterprise. The British had found an undeveloped country when they arrived, and they left behind much progress, especially among the Jews. And he also mentions that the British administrators, in effect, in their policy of leaving the infrastructure in the hands of the Jews when they left, they ensured or did much to ensure the ultimate British victory of the Jews over their Arab enemies. So this is something that also must be remembered. And the Jews had won their War of Independence in 1948. Then President Truman of the USA, he also supported the State of Israel. He insisted that Israel be allowed to keep the Negev area, the southern area of Israel, that had been precious for, that Israel had gained through war, and this had not been this had not been envisaged. This had not been included in the previous plans of partition. But the Jews had conquered this area from the Arabs, and they needed it for the survival of the country. So President Truman insisted that they be allowed to keep it, and they were. And so the State of Israel came into existence, and this existence was recognized by the USA, and this was very important. And President Truman was also very important in recognizing this and bringing pressure. The USA brought pressure on the nations of the world to vote in favor, in recognition of the State of Israel in the UN, which was also had significance in Jewish consciousness and world consciousness, and in the geopolitical reality of the time. This was due largely to US intervention on behalf of the Jewish state. After the establishment of the State of Israel, France helped the Jewish state maintain itself for quite a while. There were French volunteers and French money and French assistance in many ways. Britain at that stage was ambivalent, though in 1956 Britain, France and Israel were allies in the war against Egypt. And at that stage the USA under Eisenhower was antagonistic, but it was an incident that over the Suez Canal that developed into a full-stage war. Further on in 1967, Israel fought the Six-Day War against Arab states and was victorious. And after 1967, the USA became the ally of Israel, became its main ally, and in some stages its only ally, and it became its major backer and its material supporter. President John Kennedy described the relationships between Israel and the USA as parallel to that between the USA and Britain. And when he said, this is what he told Golda Meir, in other words, brother nations of one origin or similar to it. And so too, we had President Nixon, who was a genuine friend of Israel. So were most other American leaders such as President Reagan and President George Bush. And millions of Jews have been imprisoned in Eastern Europe and Russia. And under Reagan, they were released. The Jews were allowed to come back, to return to the land of Israel. And this greatly helped increase the Jewish population and the power of the state of Israel. Also, there had been Jews in Ethiopia were enabled to come to Israel through U.S. intervention or through USA assistance. And the USA has always, ever since then, has been a very powerful supporter of Israel. And at some stages it bankrupt, at one stage it bankrolled Israel to help support financially the economy of Israel. And in many ways, and until this day, the USA is the major supporter of the State of Israel. The State of Israel is surrounded by enemies, and all the world, at some times it seems to be antagonistic. It seems to be against the State of Israel. They hate the Jews. No matter what Israel does, Israel is always in the wrong according to world media. And they hate the Jews and they're against her, and they would possibly countenance in military armed intervention against the Jews on behalf of the Arabs if it was not for the USA providing us with protection and its alliance with us. So this too must be kept in mind. We have to realize that. But the Jews are alone. The Jews are alone and have very few friends, and those friends they do have are to be found amongst Western nations, especially Britain and the USA and related countries. Even though these countries are also often against Israel, they do have a strong tendency or historic tradition of helping us. And this is what we have to know. This is the reality. And also, you must realize that in the USA itself, there's not all of one cloth. There are different elements that are against the Jews, or that would come to terms with the Arabs. And liberal elements, all kinds of different forces, and the oil interests, and third world sentiments, and alliances, and Arab intervention, and so on. But on the whole, the USA remains strongly in support of Israel, and one of the major factors in ensuring this support of Israel is due to evangelical Christians who identify the State of Israel. And people who believe in the Bible amongst these Western nations have always proved the strongest supporters of the State of Israel. And this is what we have been speaking of. In effect, the very establishment of the State of Israel, of the British mandate over Palestine, and the encouragement of the Zionist enterprise in Palestine, within Palestine, had first begun due to beliefs amongst Christians, amongst peoples in the West, especially amongst the British, that the Jews should be allowed to establish their own state in Palestine. And this is what happened, and it was parallel to a similar belief amongst the Jews. Then too we had the establishment of the State of Israel, and the State of Israel establishing itself and expanding and becoming a successful enterprise also, thanks to the intervention and the help of people in the West. And amongst those people in the West who were helping us, those who believed in the Bible were especially important. And even in saving the Jews in the Holocaust times, so it was due to all those Jews who were saved due to the innate sympathy of others, from all walks of life and from all different political and philosophical orientations. But amongst those who were most strongly immersed in biblical studies, who had more of a biblical orientation, historically they were the ones who stood out, who were disproportionately helpful to the Jewish people. And we would say that there was another element, there's an element of inheritance, an element of racial or physical inheritance, that many of these peoples were in effect descended from Israelites, and the truth of physical ancestry, physical descent, combined with biblical consciousness, is what triggers off this identification with the Jewish people and with the cause of Israel in general. And this is something that we should know and be aware of. That the ancestry combined with biblical truth, biblical knowledge, biblical awareness is what brings out, what helps develop biblical and Israelite consciousness, and an affinity between the Jews and the peoples of Western Europe, or of Western European descent. And many of these peoples, as we said, were descended from Israelites. Abraham was the first ancestor of the Hebrew nation, and him who was stated, Abraham shall be a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him. He will command his children and his household after him, and shall keep the way of the Lord to do justice and judgment, that the Lord may bring upon Abraham that which he has spoken of him. This blessing and person becoming a great and mighty nation was not only an effect, but also a prerequisite of having all the nations of the earth being blessed in him and of doing justice and judgment. And this is what these nations historically did. We had the French Empire, and we had the Dutch Empire, and we had the British Empire, and these empires had a policy of colonialism and of helping the natives, and in most cases their rule was beneficial to the native peoples. They ruled over. They put a stop to internecine warfare. They stopped these peoples killing each other, wiping each other out, stopped them from enslaving each other. They put a stop to human sacrifice and all kinds of perversions and oppressions that prevailed in India and in other places. They wiped out slavery. They eliminated slavery, even though that once at the beginning they had participated in the slave trade. But they stopped it. In the end, they stopped slavery not only amongst themselves but throughout the world. They reformed agricultural practices, public hygiene. They built bridges, roads, public works, and so on. And they educated the peoples, and these peoples were, relatively speaking, compared to what they had previously been, were much better off under them. And even today, the concept of morality and of international standards of good behaviour are due to these people, and they are the ones who enforce such policies and such attitudes. And we want to emphasize that we're not racist. We're not coming to present any racialist doctrine. All of mankind is descended from one ancestor, and the characteristics of every nation are due to historical factors, historical experiences, cultural influences. The climate may also play a part. The climate, the environment, all kinds, everything that everything connected with our existence determines who we are and influences us. And it may be that whatever the cause, whatever the ultimate cause, there is something behind it, some directive force behind it, which we don't have to be responsible for. As if to say, the divine providence so wanted it that certain peoples should be in certain areas and they should develop in certain ways, and their own innate national consciousness also led them along this track, which brought them to a certain level of humanity and humaneness, and of cultural values and of civilization. And this was possibly due, more than anything else, to belief in the Bible and acceptance of biblical values. So this is what we have to realize. And so we have to know that this is the reality. We are alone. The Israelite nations are alone. The Israelite nations have certain descent. They come from certain peoples, and we can prove that they come from these peoples. We can prove that the nations of the West are descended from Hebrews, and we have proved it. And this descent is a certain physical element, and the physical element combined with environmental factors and historical factors and belief in the Bible has brought us to where we are. And the time has now come for us to realize, for the Western nations to realize, that they are brother nations to the Jews, and that they have been blessed in certain ways, but this blessing has been concomitant, has come together with national obligations, biblical obligations, that must be faced up to and accepted. And may the Lord God Almighty, the Lord God, who is the God of Israel, the God of creation, is the God of Israel. He is the one who speaks to us in the Bible, who reveals himself to the Bible. The Bible is the book that says that the Israelite nations have been chosen. That is what the Bible says, and this is the reality. And this reality must be internalized and accepted, and its implications have to be played out by us, because we are the players in this field. Thank you very much. This is Yair Davidi. I've been speaking to you from Jerusalem, the capital of Israel. I've been speaking to you on behalf of Brit Am Hebrew Nations.